So the first panel, the first plenary set the stage for the discussion. So we had, Jayashree, who scared us a little bit with some of her slides. And then we had Sharad telling us how, the way to address these problems is to start by taking a panga. And then in the second plenary, we engaged with the counterintuitive thought that constraints can be sources of creativity. And now we're all set to explore the possibility of partnerships. This is actually a fairly important aspect of the whole thing, because we're talking about the challenges of Anthropocene. When we talk about that, we usually use words such as planet scale and global. So it means two things. One is, of course, it refers to the massive scale of the challenges. But the second thing, it also indicates that boundaries are not very relevant. When we're talking about changes in temperature or pollution, line of control and line of actual control may not matter that much. So to also address these challenges in an impactful way and at scale, we need to create partnerships across traditional boundaries between governments and business, between for-profits and not-for-profits, between innovators and bureaucrats, and such stuff. And this means that we are going to have individuals and institutions which are wired in a certain way, with different kinds of goals, different incentive systems, different cultures, who have to work together and continue to work together. And such partnerships can get quite complex, conceptualizing them and executing them. And to explore this, we have got three remarkable people who are going to be sharing their experiences in leveraging partnerships in different areas. We're going to have Professor Mahesh Shankaran, professor at NCBS, who will be talking about working across continents to save the savannas. Then we'll have Dr. Ashish Nimgaonkar talking about scaling impact by innovation, biomedical innovation. And then we'll have Dr. Chintan Vaishnav talk about forging global partnerships to nurture startup ecosystems. Chintan is not able to join us today, so he has kindly sent us a video with some of his remarks, and we'll play that. First, I'd like to invite Dr. Mahesh Shankaran on stage. Mahesh, please. So Dr. Mahesh Shankaran is Professor of Ecology and Ecosystems at NCBS, Bangalore. He's one of the researchers whose work is helping reshape our view on the role of ecosystems and climate change. He got his PhD from Syracuse University, and he also did his postdoctoral work in US and UK before joining NCBS in 2009. He has recently played a pivotal role in an IPCC publication, which highlighted the work of biodiversity and ecosystems in the relationship to climate change. And his work has also been recognized by his fellowships. He's recently been elected to the Fellowship of the Indian Academy of Science in 2020 and the Indian National Science Academy in 2021.
Thank you for asking me to be a part of this session. And in the interest of full disclosure, I must say that this is an entirely different kind of audience from the one that I'm used to. And hopefully my talk will sort of meet the remit that was given to me. So I was asked to talk about cross-continental collaborations that we're involved with in terms of savanna ecology. And well, we work with a lot of ecologists from across the world, in Africa, South America, Australia, and so on and so forth, addressing questions of very basic scientific relevance, right? But I thought that's probably less of an interest to this group. So what I thought I'd talk about today is a kind of challenge that all of us, or all savanna ecologists working across the globe seem to face. We've written about it, we've written policy pieces, we've written, perspectives in sort of high impact papers and journals and so on and so forth. But the problem is, we keep shouting, but nobody seems to be listening. So I really don't know what the answer to this. We've been trying to collaborate to get this message across, and it seems to be one not of uptaking new technologies or ideas, but of unlearning what seems to be ingrained in many of us. And I think that's really a hard problem. I don't know what the answer to it is. So what I thought I'd do is actually just highlight the challenge that we've been talking about, and then, hopefully there will be avenues for collaboration and so on and so forth. So, so what I'm going to talk about is actually the issue with planting trees in these open ecosystems that we work in. I don't want to start off on a negative note, but just to set the context, people have already talked about this in the morning, right? But we know fossil fuel combustion and land use changes have caused an increase in greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. This is the famous Keeling curve, which shows CO2 concentrations on the top of Mauna Loa. It's been the longest continuous measurements of CO2 that we have. And as you can see, CO2 concentrations seem to be increasing over time. We all know this, and currently it's about 420 parts per million. And because of this increase in greenhouse gases, we know temperatures globally have also been changing. This is a figure that shows global temperatures over time, and every successive decade has been warmer than the previous. 8 of the last hottest years have been in the last decade. And 2023, we've hit records in terms of the summer temperatures, hottest ever recorded, and we're probably on track to break annual records too. Time will tell. And as Nelson was talking about early in the morning, the thing is ocean temperatures are also going up. And the NASA webpage had an article a few months ago saying the ocean has a fever because they recorded the highest temperatures ever in July this year. And as you can see the black line, these warmer temperatures are continuing, right? So this is a bit of a problem. We are in an El Nino phase that can possibly extend into next year. And this has major consequences for coral reefs and ocean life and so on and so forth, right? And the thing is, governments over the last couple of decades have recognized that we seem to be in this sort of pickle with respect to climate change, and so we need to do something about it. And so there's been this call for climate action. And there are two basic approaches here. One is technological solutions to actually reduce the emissions in the first place, and also probably reduce atmospheric CO2 concentrations through carbon capture and so on. And the other one that's been put out quite a bit are these nature-based solutions, right? And one caveat here is, while nature-based solutions are necessary, they are unlikely to be sufficient in terms of mitigating climate change in the absence of any technological solutions, right? But I'm going to be focusing a little bit on these nature-based solutions. And one nature-based solution that seems to have, that seems to be all the rage right now is tree planting to sequester carbon from the atmosphere, right? And this has led to many initiatives like the Trillion Trees program to plant 1 trillion trees across the globe. And more locally, we can see, these different governments from different states are trying to plant 22 crores of trees in a day, or even, 1 lakh saplings in the arid, cold deserts of, the Ladakh region. And while reforestation, that is the planting of trees in areas that the trees were there earlier, is definitely something we need to be focusing on, afforestation, which is the planting of trees in areas that they weren't there earlier, can be problematic, right? And which are these kind of areas where we need to be a little cautious when we are planting trees? And those are the kinds of systems that we work on, which are grasslands and savanna ecosystems. Now, the term savanna, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it refers, well, it's a 16th century word. Well, it was first recorded in the 16th century, and it's derived from a Carib Amerindian word, which means treeless plain. But in its current avatar, it refers to systems that have both trees and grasses. So you have a continuous grass layer, and you have a discontinuous layer of trees, right? And the reason why people tend to plant trees in savannas, and a lot of these tree planting initiatives are focused on these open natural ecosystems, which are savannas and grassland. Why is that? For many reasons. One, if you want to plant a tree, you're looking for an open space. And here's a lot of open space where you can actually go and plant trees. The other is this outdated concept of a climax community, which, people tend to think that forests are the climax, and systems like these are actually degraded forests, that humans have gone sometime in the past, cut these trees, and made these systems open. And so these are degraded systems that actually, need to be restored. But both our work and the work of colleagues across the globe has shown that savannas are not degraded ecosystems. They're in fact very ancient ecosystems. They evolved in the late Miocene, about 5 to 10 million years ago. And they're fairly widespread, and these are not degraded forests. The other issue, major issue facing savannas and grasslands, particularly in the Indian context, is they're classified as wastelands administratively, right? This is a fallout from a colonial legacy. But the fact is, if they're classified as wastelands, then they can easily be diverted to other uses, such as tree planting initiatives, right? But like I said, savannas are actually fairly ancient ecosystems. They're very widespread. They cover about 20% of the Earth's land surface and more than half the area of the southern continents. They support a large fraction of the world's human population and a majority of its rangeland and livestock. And for ecologists like me, they're home to the greatest diversity and density of wild herbivores and carnivores of any ecosystem on Earth. Now, most of you, if you watch National Geographic or Discovery, you'd have seen, the first image that comes to of a savanna is the Serengeti. That's, these vast open plains teeming with ungulates. But that's not the only place where you have savannas. Like I said, savannas are fairly widely distributed, and we also have them in the Indian context. But they tend to be a little bit more wooded compared to systems in Africa, right? So the savannas of India, these are again photos of Indian savanna ecosystems. They host very iconic species, many of which are threatened. You have the black buck, you have foxes, you have hyenas, and you have the great Indian bustard there on the left, of which there are only about 100 individuals left remaining in the wild. It's a highly threatened bird. It was a contender for the national bird of India, but if rumors are to be believed, then it lost out to the peacock because, a simple spelling mistake or a mispronunciation can lead to, embarrassment for, the country. So anyway, so all of these iconic species are characteristic of these open savanna ecosystems. But the problem is they're not as protected when compared to forests. So many of these grasslands in India are actually not protected. Right. And when we look at savanna ecosystems, typically you see an open space, right? And so there's no carbon. You can't actually see any carbon being sequestered above ground. So people tend to think that savannas and grasslands don't play a role in the global carbon cycle. But that's not true. If you look at net primary production, that's the amount of carbon that's fixed per unit area per year. Savannas are actually, they account for about 30% or about a third of the carbon that's being fixed by the terrestrial biosphere is actually occurring in these grasslands and savannas. And compared to tropical forests, which are obviously, the highest in terms of fixing carbon, savannas sequester about 7 tons per hectare per year. So it's not trivial, right? So they do play an important role in the global carbon cycle. But interestingly, most of this carbon is actually stored below ground. Savannas have much, much more carbon under the ground than above the ground. So because we don't see that much carbon above ground, we tend to think they're actually not useful as carbon sinks. But, tropical savannas store almost as much as tropical rainforests in terms of soil carbon. And if you look at temperate grasslands, that's even more. So most of the carbon in these ecosystems is actually below ground. And that's something we need to keep in mind. Yeah? And so the problem, like I said, is everybody and their uncle seems to be going out and planting trees in these ecosystems. And this is problematic for many reasons, right? So tree planting in these ecosystems can actually be a form of degradation rather than restoration. And like I said, there have been a lot of papers written about this in recent years. But again, there seems to be some difficulty with these concepts actually being sort of absorbed and put into practice. Why is it problematic? Why is tree planting in these ecosystems problematic? For one, plantations in these regions often fail. and they don't bring the anticipated carbon benefits. Now you have to put a lot of effort and water into actually getting these saplings and seedlings to survive in these ecosystems in the first place. And the second thing is fire and herbivory are integral parts of these ecosystems. So many of the saplings are either eaten by herbivores or they're burnt, and they tend to die, right? So many of the plantations actually fail. The other thing is loss of soil carbon. When you dig pits to plant these trees, you tend to lose soil carbon. And some studies have shown that actually, when you plant trees in these systems, you tend to lose carbon from the soil such that the net amount of carbon in the ecosystem actually goes down, which kind of beats the whole purpose of planting trees there in the first place, right? We're not really sure why that occurs and when that occurs, but it has been known to occur. The third thing, and somebody was talking about water earlier today, is that thirsty trees compromise hydrological cycles. Trees transpire much more water than grasses, with the result that when you plant trees in many of these ecosystems, it actually affects the hydrological cycles, it can affect stream flow, it can reduce stream flow and so on, right? So that's another unintended consequence of tree planting. And finally, grazing for pastoralists. There are millions of pastoralists who actually depend on these lands for their livelihood. And when you plant trees, you reduce grasses, which is what the grazers need, and so it reduces the grazing potential of these lands, right? And so it comes at a cost to livelihoods. And finally, there's loss of native biodiversity. Like I said, these grasslands evolved 5 to 8 million years ago, and all of those spectacular ungulates that you see all over Africa and these dry forest, dry system species in India, they all evolved at the same time. They co-evolved with these grasslands, right? And so we tend to lose this native biodiversity when we plant trees and convert these ecosystems into something else that they were not meant to be, right? So the message here is that, and this is a message that savanna ecologists have been trying to make across the globe, unfortunately with limited success, is that tree planting programs in these ecosystems must be carefully planned. You need to plant the right trees in the right places at the right densities, right? And so rather than plant trees in grasslands, what we need to be doing is prioritizing the restoration of forests or reforestation, planting trees in areas where they were already there before. And for grasslands, we actually need to be working on restoring grasslands. Our work has shown that even after 20 years of, keeping herbivores, keeping fires, and increasing tree densities, most of the carbon in these systems are actually coming from the grasses. The grasses are still the drivers of soil carbon. So we need to be finding ways to restore these grasslands. Unfortunately, unlike tree planting, restoring grasslands is a major problem. We really don't know how to do it properly, right? And there's clearly a need for much more work here to be able to successfully restore these grasslands. Of course, planting in urban, semi-urban, farmland edges, all of that is fine. We should be encouraging that. And provided food security is not compromised, we can plant some amount of trees in grasslands, but we need to ensure, and in savannas, but we need to ensure that they're planted at the right densities, right? And I'm just going to finish, if I have time, to just show 3 or 4 slides, a little story of how planting the wrong trees in the wrong place can have very long-lasting unintended consequences. I don't know how many of you have seen these ecosystems, the Shola grassland mosaics. If you go to the higher elevations of the Western Ghats, you'll see this very unique ecosystem. And this is pretty unique because it's a system where you have both trees and grasses in the same place under the same climate, right? And unfortunately, you see these systems in other parts of the globe, like in Angola, Gabon, South Africa, Brazil, and so on, but they're very restricted where they occur. So they're highly localized and they're highly threatened ecosystems. So this is a story about the Nilgiris and Ooty. I'm sure most of you have been to Ooty. Is there anybody here who's been to Ooty before? Yeah? Right, so in the early 1800s, when the British first went to Ooty, this is what Ooty looked like. So I had a student who went to the India office in the British Library and went through all the old colonial literature. And so Ooty in 1834 looked like this. It was a forest grassland mosaic. That is Ooty Lake there, by the way. And the Britishers looked at this, the colonial foresters, and they had this philosophy that trees are the climax communities and grasslands are not. So they looked at this and said, the indigenous people have totally mismanaged this habitat. This should be a forest, but because of their mismanagement of the habitat, this is what it looks like. But we know now, based on paleo evidence, that these systems have existed for at least 40,000 years, long before humans have come in, right? And so what did the British do? Colonial foresters went and started planting trees. So this is St. Stephen's Church in Ooty. This is what it looked like in 1834. Then they started planting trees. By 1851, it looked like this. By 1905, you'd converted this grassland into this. And 2015, this is what it looks like. So a native grassland that was unique, hosted unique species, hosted endemic species, all of it's gone. The interesting thing here to note is that they tried planting native trees, and all of those plantations failed. So what the British did was they brought about 40 different species from across the globe, and some of them succeeded. Actually, if you go to Ooty now, most of what you see is actually pines and eucalyptus and all native, non-native species. And one species in particular, Acacia mayonzii, a wattle, got out of control, right? And so this is what it looks like. So this green patch is what the native habitat is. All of that dirty green around it is grassland that's been invaded by this one species, Acacia mayonzii. It's just gone out of control. We're not really sure how to control it. It's changing hydrological cycles, it's changing biodiversity, it's changing everything, right? So we just need to be aware when the next time we go to plant a tree that you're actually planting the right tree in the right place, and it's a native species and not an exotic species. So bringing it all down, essentially what we need are win-win solutions to this problem. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPCC and IPBES, had a joint report that came out a couple of years ago. And essentially what they highlighted there is that we have two crises. We're dealing with a climate crisis, but we're also dealing with a biodiversity crisis. And both of these are linked. So climate change is linked to biodiversity loss, and both of these can have the potential to negatively impact human well-being and quality of life. And you cannot focus on one while ignoring the other. And that's what we've been doing for the most part, is we've just been focusing on climate change and trying to mitigate climate change, but this is coming at a cost of biodiversity. And we need to stop and think about our approaches going ahead, right? And this is a bit of a confusing figure. You don't need to worry about it, but this is again from the same report. On the top, it shows on the left, the actions you can take for climate, and on the right, its implications for biodiversity. So the blue lines are ones that have positive effects on both sides. The red lines are when climate actions have a negative impact on biodiversity. And at the bottom, it's the other way around, biodiversity actions and its impact on climate. So as you can see on the top, there are a lot more red lines. So if you just focus on climate, it's going to have a lot more negative effects on biodiversity, whereas if we approach it from a restoration viewpoint where we also keep biodiversity in mind, then there are a lot more win-win solutions when it comes to climate, right? And so that's the take-home message, is basically we need to be thinking not just about climate, but also about biodiversity and human well-being. And when it comes to actually implementing these, like I said, there seems to be this belief for many of the people that trees are good and a forest is good where a grassland is bad. And this is something people have done a survey, and it's called biome awareness disparity. It's not just here. Globally, people seem to value forests more than grasslands. And how do we change that? Because unless you change that, we're not going to be able to sort of address these issues that impact biodiversity. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that question, but it requires working with forest department officials, it requires working with government officials, it requires working with industry, CSR, people who are giving money to plant trees, should think about where these trees are going to be planted, right? And if it's planted in the right place, then that's great. So I'd like to stop there. Maybe I've just gone on more than I should. But yeah, I'd like to thank all of these people.
Now I'd like to call upon Dr. Ashish Nimgaonkar. Dr. Nimgaonkar is a physician scientist, entrepreneur, and educator. He is founder and chief medical officer and chief of R&D at Glycine Therapeutics, which is developing innovative gut-restricted oral medication for obesity and type 2 diabetes. He also holds an academic position at Johns Hopkins University and is an active gastroenterologist at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Dr. Nimgaonkar is an accomplished and award-winning innovator, and his research is funded by the National Institutes of Health and National Health Foundation in the US. He's got a very well-rounded academic background as well. He's an MBBS, he's a physician from Osmania. Then he gained MTech from IIT Bombay and an MSc from Harvard MIT's Division of Health Sciences and Technology. And he completed his residency in internal medicine at Harvard and undertook dual fellowships in gastroenterology and design at Stanford.
Thanks for the generous introduction, Sivaram. And I'm really glad that I'm sandwiched between two terrific speakers, because as they say, as long as the beginning and the end is good, no one cares about the middle. I don't have any slides to share, but I do want to share some of my perspectives and stories that I've gathered over the last 2 decades. And some of these exemplify the real power of collaboration and partnerships. You know, when it comes to innovation in biomedicine, it's really hard, right? And by definition, innovation requires interdisciplinary crosstalk and collaboration across different aspects of research and development. The earliest memory actually that I had, which inspired and triggered me to going into becoming a researcher and an entrepreneur, was the Human Genome Project. Some of you may have heard Human Genome Project, which was the first project of its kind sponsored by the US government to sequence the entire human genome, which had 3 billion base pairs. This was almost 20 years back, and it took close to 10 years to get the whole entire human genome sequenced, but it required collaboration between 20 different universities across 4 different continents at a price tag of somewhere between $3 to $5 billion. But it was a collaboration at scale that since has really reinvented the whole field of biotech industry, whether it be diagnostics or drug discovery. I always had the aspiration to be an entrepreneur ever since I learned about these discoveries. And the real inspiration was to get products from conception into patient care to have a global impact. But when I started on this journey, I was very naive in my thinking, and I used to think that all it mattered for a successful product was to have a great idea, and then some magic happened. But that magic was really planning and execution, and a large part of that was building teams and leading these teams across not just the company, but also our multiple different organizations. This is particularly important in a healthcare startup. By definition, a startup is resource constrained. And when you're trying to build a company from scratch, you have to rely on external partners and collaborators and be resourceful in how you manage those partnerships. Whether it's early stage R&D, where you are talking to other scientists and as well as groups outside your sphere of expertise, or later stage drug development, which we are at my company Glycin. We are now a phase 2 clinical stage company, and we talk to a lot of CROs and pharma partners. At the end of the day, it is the individuals that you're talking to on the other side of the table. And it comes back to aligned incentives and ambitions. By definition, these kind of collaborations are pretty complex and can be really symbiotic if they are structured the right way. An example that comes to my mind is the discovery of insulin. More than 100 years back, Fred Banting, who was a physician scientist, discovered insulin in his lab in Canada. And for many years, he toyed around with trying to make the insulin, synthesize the insulin. It was a phenomenal discovery, but it went nowhere until he found the right partner in Eli Lilly, which is a global pharma company, and the rest is history. And that just exemplifies that you as an individual can do only so many things, and to really have impact at scale requires this kind of sort of collaboration. So, but collaborations are not without their risks. When I looked at the failures in biomedical innovation, what I learned and realized was most of the failures happen because of stakeholder mismanagement, misalignment of expectations, and differing risk tolerance between the partners. So no matter how promising a collaboration is, it is essential to build that relationship and address potential failure points very early on in that partnership. Because at the end of the day, we are, as individuals, are only one drop, but together we make the ocean. And so it is critical that we have a shared vision and alignment as we execute on a goal which is for the greater good. Thanks.
Chintan Vaishnav is currently the Mission Director, Atal Innovation Mission at Niti Aayog. And also more to the context, he chaired the Startup 20 track during India's G20 presidency recently. Chintan is a socio-technologist trained as an engineer to design large systems which have both human complexity as well as technological complexity. He is currently on leave from his academic position at MIT to work at Niti Aayog. As teacher, innovator and entrepreneur, Chintan splits his time between teaching and research at MIT and living and working with rural communities in India to build solutions that can overcome constraints and constraints that are fundamental to the human condition. Chintan couldn't join us, so he has sent us his remarks over a video.
Many of you know about Startup 20. This was the only new engagement group under India's G20 presidency. India proposed it, we took it from 0 to 1, and now it has been made a permanent feature of the G20 architecture as we move forward. This is an important moment. In some ways, in the global startup policy, this is a watershed moment because until now, G20 has had only one group that represented businesses called the B20 or the Business 20. Going forward, there will be two groups representing businesses. B20 that will represent the large corporations, and Startup 20 will represent startups and the SMEs. This is the first year in G20's history when startups have written a policy recommendation for the world leaders. They've asked for several things in this policy recommendation. First of all, the 20 nations plus the 9 invited nations came together to call upon the world leaders to raise the annual investment in the global startup ecosystem to $1 trillion annually, which is about 2.5 to 3 times what it has been over years. In addition, they've asked for the globe to embrace global frameworks for startup definition, governance framework that startups can embrace, and so on, so that the valuation can become in line with value. They have suggested ways of creating access for startups to global financial capital, to global talent, global markets, global mentors, and so on. They've advocated emphasizing inclusive practices and have cataloged some of the greatest practices that exist in inclusion today across the globe. They have identified ways for taking startups that are of global interest global. And then finally, they have called upon the world to create a globally networked institution of existing agencies so that startups that deserve to go global can go global more easily. Um, Sorry for a lot of information very quickly, but this is very relevant to this forum. First of all, I must say that I'm terribly sorry that I can't be with you in person there in Hyderabad. This is indeed one of my favorite forums organized by IKP. Every time I've come there, I have learned a lot, and I'm sure you have a lot of excitement coming as this conference gets underway. Now, this year's theme of sort of positively impacting the Anthropocene is a very relevant theme to what is happening with respect to the creation of this Startup 20 as well. If you take almost any problem that is created due to human activity, or where human activity is a major contributor today, take any sustainable development goal today, and you break it up into smaller pieces of the puzzle that we will have to address in order for us to address the SDG, and then go out and look for startups everywhere across the world to see if there are startups solving pieces of these puzzles, and I bet you for any challenge that you take on, you will find great startups in some or the other corner of the world solving for that piece of the puzzle. The need of the hour is to have a platform that brings these startups together more seamlessly so that they can work together and they can make a difference on the Anthropocene positively. So I hope with the creation of this Startup 20 as a forum that enables such work, and I welcome you all to come participate as we turn this great policy communique that we have produced into action through various platforms. Thank you very much.
To stay informed about the startup ecosystem, subscribe to My Startup TV.